Hi everybody, we're just waiting for everybody to be able to join us and get online and sort out their connections. So we'll just give everybody a few moments to join us. It looks like everybody is connecting, so that's always good news. So thank you all very much for joining us on this occasion, our 6th annual ISSUP event. So that's very exciting for us. We're delighted that technology allows us to meet with you all and still hold events like this when in-person travel is more of a challenge. And it's great to be able to still have these opportunities to hold our events and speak to you all as you take time out of your very busy work lives to join us, for which we are very grateful. I will start off with some housekeeping points. There will be a certificate of attendance sent to everybody who is online today, so that will come to you via email. This whole event is being recorded, and those recordings will be uploaded to the ISSUP YouTube channel and on the ISSUP website. So if you want to watch back or share it with people that were unable to attend, then please do so on the ISSUP website. If you have questions for our presenters as they are going through the session today, please pop that in the questions section and we'll be collating those and feeding those through to our moderator to pose. You know, there's not a huge amount of time. We can never get through all of them, but we do appreciate your questions for us to feed through to our speakers. And the presentations this week are all being interpreted into 4 languages. So if you have a look in the chat, you will see the instructions for the interpretation if you wish to listen in another language, and you can ask us questions about that if there are any problems, but you should be able to access that there. So moving on to get us started. As most people are aware, our mission is to establish substance use prevention, treatment and recovery support as a unique and multidisciplinary field through the professionalisation and development of our network of substance use prevention, treatment and recovery support professionals. And I always want to put this out there as a little reminder, a reinforcement, I guess, that when we think about this network, this community of the workforce, we really are including all elements within it, from volunteers, family members, through to those of you that have made it your lifelong academic study or your full-time career to focus on this subject. And we want to recognise that every part, every piece, every person is essential and valuable in our joint efforts. And with the input, support and engagement of our ISSUP members, we are growing and going from strength to strength. We've almost 22,000 members around the world. We have 26 established national chapters and 6 that are in development. Work is continually ongoing to post and share useful information on our website and all of our sort of digital communications channels. We have an extensive webinar program which is running, and I know many of you are joining us on those, and we have exciting new topics to cover for next year. Online training is developing via our partners at Colombo Plan and GCCC. So there are universal curriculum coming online to take self-led or instructor-led shortly. So there's huge amounts of growth and development. A key thing for us, of course, is our event, which is we're being planned to take place the 11th to the 17th of May next year in partnership with NRC, ICUDDR and INL. And that will be taking place in person in Abu Dhabi and online. So we're very much looking forward to doing all of this again, hopefully with you next year, and keep your eye on the website and our communications channels for information about that event going live this month. ISSUP is very lucky to be supported by INL, the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, and we enjoy excellent working relationships with all the international organisations and INL partners. And we're very lucky to be able to bring the services, the work that these organisations are doing to our ISSUP members. We rely very heavily on the expertise and know-how within our partner organisations, and we're very grateful for the support of them. So if you are not already an ISSUP member, I do urge you to join. It's free. You can connect with us, connect with national chapters if there is one in your country, and engage with your colleagues around the world. Thank you again for joining us today. Thank you to the ISSUP team led by Ghafri for working so hard to develop this event. Thank you to all our speakers. I mean, we will be able to touch base with all of them across the week, but today to Harry, Sumnall and Ghafri for speaking. And I would now like to hand over to Brian Morales, Branch Chief at the Office of Global Programs and Policy at the INL Bureau at the US Department of State. Thank you, Brian, for speaking to everybody here this morning.
Great. No, thank you so much, Joanna. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with all of our colleagues from around the world. So good morning from a chilly Washington, D.C. I hope that all of you and your families are doing well. We have had quite a year, quite a difficult couple of years. As we conclude the second year of the pandemic, we really find a world that's been transformed. We continue to face challenges in our communities, from physical and mental health to issues of employment and education, to name a few. But I'm concerned for the professionals in the field of substance use. And we've had a lot of discussions, a lot of webinars over the past months, and we are hearing that they really are carrying a very heavy weight on their shoulders. The pandemic has added a number of challenges to the work of professionals at all corners, in all corners of the world. One of these challenges is increased global consumption, particularly with new consumer markets in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. There's a growing popularity of synthetic drugs, which is equally concerning. Synthetic drugs are easy to manufacture at a lower cost. They're easy to transport. They're easy to sell on the dark web and the clear web. They're very easy to monetize, including through virtual currencies. So the future of synthetic drugs is very concerning. The United States has seen a record of 100,000 overdose deaths over 12 months, the highest on record for the United States. And so this broad availability of the drug supply around the world concerns us deeply, combined with the risk factors and vulnerabilities among youth. It really requires us to redouble our efforts and to really take concerted action. So these are big challenges that we face in our field. But we have good news too. And we know that substance use disorders is a chronic and relapsing disease that can be effectively handled. More than 70 years of scientific research shows that prevention and treatment can work. We still find some policymakers that seem unaware of this fact, but there is no debate here. Drug use prevention is a validated field of science, and substance use treatment is a validated field of science. It works. We have evidence that it works. And this powerful truth is what brings us here this week, and what motivates us and the people that we help on a daily basis. In these times, we're fortunate to have an organization like ISSUP that unites and supports that global workforce. And so I want to thank Joanna Travis-Roberts, the Executive Director of ISSUP, for her vision for the organization from day one, and the former director, Ghafri, who gave direction to the organization also from its inception, and continues to build that coherence and collaboration in the field by connecting that science to practice, which is really the theme of the conference this week. In order to advance our common mission, my Bureau of INL in the US Department of State has been working with international partners to build an interconnected ecosystem. And at the center of this ecosystem is ISSUP and its 22,000 members and its 26 national chapters that continue to grow every day. So I want to start first by commending ISSUP for your contributions to the field, not only by offering a sort of top-notch website that brings us all together, but also by offering the library of over 100 courses that are manualized in 20-something languages. And then also most recently by partnering with Healthy Knowledge to then offer instructor-led courses and self-led on-demand courses, which I think is going to be a very big growth for the organization in terms of activity and membership and participation. But I also want to say that we've built a very strong and interconnected network of partners that work to support ISSUP. Beyond training, ISSUP can offer its members examination and credentialing through the Global Center for Credentialing and Certification, GCCC. Then there's the academic and higher education development through the International Consortium of Universities for Drug Demand Reduction, ICUDDR. And also many countries are now establishing international technology transfer centers, which were launched this year to conduct systematic diagnostic assessments of their public health and criminal justice sectors. And we've also built a close-knit network of international organizations who serve as strong champions of ISSUP, as Joanna was mentioning, and that includes Colombo Plan, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the African Union Commission, the Organization of American States, the Pan American Health Organization, which we started working even more closely with this year, and the World Health Organization. But our work to build a global ecosystem to address substance use is not yet complete. This coming year, we're going to see the establishment of new partners. In 2022, we invite you to join us for the launch of the International Consortium on Quality in Treatment, ICQ, to help governments and independent agencies monitor treatment services around the world and improve their quality. In 2022, we will also launch a formal network on alternatives to conviction and punishment, working with partner countries to assess their criminal justice systems, to conduct intensive trainings, and to offer technical assistance as well. The program will help move people with substance use disorders from the courts and prisons into treatment centers and into a life of recovery, free from drugs and associated criminal behaviors. Our final big event for next year, as Joanna was mentioning, is the 8th Global ISSUP meeting in Abu Dhabi in May, and I hope to see you all there. It's going to be a great celebration of the field and getting together once again. To conclude, individually, we may feel that we cannot tackle this problem of substance use, that the challenges are vast, that our work is difficult day in and day out. But as I mentioned, we are a huge community of tens of thousands of people from different fields and sectors united with a common mission. So when you find yourselves struggling with difficult circumstances in your communities, know that you have a global community of supporters behind you, available to connect and support you in your work. And we're united in our common appreciation for evidence-based practices and the need to apply that science to the field. And that's why a global meeting like the one that we have this week has such power to transform. So I'm very excited by the presenters that we're going to hear today and for the next few days. I want to conclude by thanking ISSUP for hosting, thanking the presenters for contributing to our knowledge base, and thanking the participants for absorbing and sharing these best practices that they're learning this week. Our continuous search for evidence will ultimately equip us with the best tools to tackle this dynamic, complex, and ever-evolving disease. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you to INL for its continued support and championing this field, and ISSUP, of course. So I will now hand over to our moderator for today's session, and we are delighted to have a great friend of ISSUP moderating today, Dr. Shamil Wanigaratne, who is the consultant clinical psychologist and senior advisor to His Excellency at the National Rehabilitation Centre in Abu Dhabi. Dr. Shamil, thank you very much for walking us through this session, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Joanna. It's a pleasure and privilege to moderate this session, and we've just exceeded 470 participants, and it's rising by the minute. So it's a global audience, and I would like to welcome all of who have joined here. It's an exciting program. Thanks for the introduction from Joanna. I'm supposed to say a bit about myself. I would like to describe myself as an international person, currently right now operating from Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, but I'm here to represent the UAE national chapter of ISSUP that I helped establish. And before that, prior to that, I worked in the United Kingdom, UK, as the head of psychology at the Maudsley Hospital and at King's College in terms of for its addiction section. And originally I come from Sri Lanka, so there's many countries. But ISSUP, I think is an organization that unites the globe, and it's growing. So it's very exciting, and the program is very exciting. our first speaker, it's a real pleasure to introduce Jeff Lee. I think I'd like to, I see Jeff Lee as father of ISSUP. He wouldn't want me to say this, but you know, he is, as Brian mentioned, he was a key figure in the establishment of ISSUP, and he still plays a key role. Anyway, he was the first executive director of ISSUP. Jeff has also held many key roles in non-governmental sector organizations like Mentor Arabia, the United UK Council for Alcohol and Drug Education, and he comes from an education background, and I think he was a teacher to start with, and if I were to choose a teacher, I can't think of a better person than Jeff to be my teacher. So without embarrassing you, Jeff, I would like to invite you to do your presentation. Jeff, if there was a live audience, we would give you a loud applause.
Shamil, friends, colleagues, I hope you can hear me. I need to now just get my screen, if that can happen. Can I share my screen?
We can see your screen, you just need to open your PowerPoint and we should be able to view it.
Open my PowerPoint and let me do that. Can you see, you can see my screen and I can proceed?
We can't see your PowerPoint yet.
Okay.
Now we can, perfect.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for that. Me and technology are not always the best equipped. Being a father, it makes me somewhat, I say, a little bit too old to cope with all this technology. But thank you for those very kind words, Shamil. And it's a pleasure to be here to just try and give a little bit of background to this event and to thank everyone that's been involved, is going to be involved. It's an exciting event for me because it allows us at last, I think, to focus on something that I've always been focused on from my perspective, is to how can we translate what the research and the scientists and the academics have discovered about substance use prevention, treatment and recovery support, where there's been so much development, so much learning, so much discovery, and how can we translate that into practice and make a meaningful interpretation of the theory into the practical realm where it's making the difference and applying that theory into something that is meaningful. But at the same time, acknowledge that there's going to be challenges that we have to address. And basically, this is what we are trying to do. I'm trying to get my screen to go next to my next slide.
If you click on the slide, hopefully.
Click on the slide. Oh, we are. So what we've tried to do is to very much focus this 3 days, which I think if we've been face to face would have been 3 full days of sharing and meeting together. I've become a little bit informally dressed rather than these very smart people around me, because I hope it will be an informal discussion of this very important area. And what I'd like to do is to just share what I think is for me, the main focus of the conference, to know what is, do we know about the evidence base? Are we aware of what we have in terms of evidence? How can we translate those evidence into principles that we can apply and use? And how far do principles matter over the specifics? What are the challenges, the issues and the achievements that arise from trying to translate the theory into practice? And that's the focus of what I hope we can look at over the 3 days. So what we have is 3 sessions following Harry Sumnall's input this afternoon, and each of them will look at how we can look at theory and practice in the areas of treatment, prevention and recovery support. We have some very international renowned inputs from our researchers, and then we're trying to translate that into what is happening in the reality from case studies from our national chapter networks. And we hope that the question and answers sessions will start the dialogue of how we can address some of the questions and challenges that the inputs provide. So why this focus? As Brian has said and Joanna has mentioned, when I look at the keywords and challenges for drug demand reduction, these are the words that often arise in audiences I've come across. The issue of evidence-based, quality controls, quality standards, ethical, what's the ethical concept and component of our work? How can we judge effectiveness? What are the principles of the work that should underpin what we do? And how that impacts on both the practice, but also the practice impacts on the policy, because we can often get little units of practice going on that we can call evidence-based or that isn't evidence-based, but how does that impact policy to have perhaps a larger impact? And then there's a list of other issues that often come up, words that keep coming around in terms of the areas that we perhaps need to address in respect to applying the evidence base and those issues. So looking at how we train, what issues around fidelity, issues around adaptation, always the issue of money and cost effectiveness, and accreditation and professionalization, and building partnerships. But the focus over these 3 days is on the red words, and how we can, let's say, focus on translating what is good sound theory into solid practice. As I've mentioned, we've got key people, and I really thank them for the time they've given to support this event this week. Both our moderators, such significant people who could have a lot to say on the issue themselves, I know, with their experience and expertise. Shamil obviously is a particularly experienced person who could have a lot to contribute. We've got quality researchers from the international work that they've done. But we've also got, and it's very important for me to remember, we've got active and able practitioners, and we've been fortunate enough to try and get those inputs from people who are involved with our national chapters, practically working as national chapters, or with their host organizations, or with the network organizations that they've been involved with. And I think that's really a great team effort and network working together. And of course, I've got to acknowledge the support that Brian, INL have given us, and of course my colleagues in ISSUP who have made this happen, and who we wouldn't be able to have such events without their support and input. I think it's important to just say, what is ISSUP about and what is our vision? And we've made it very stated that we have to have a connected, trained, knowledgeable, and let me just find my, sorry, how do I go back? Sorry, the mission is about how we can build a network of substance use prevention, treatment and recovery professionals who can undertake and promote high quality, evidence-based and ethical substance use prevention, treatment and recovery support. And that is a key focus for ISSUP, and we have to keep asking that question, is how we go about achieving that, are we achieving that, and how we can build that and improve that. But I think there are also questions, as you hear over the next 3 days, the inputs that we may want to consider. As always, when we get evidence, we have to ask the question, can we rely on that evidence? Is there any impact of the evidence that's relevant to different cultures and different countries? Is it something that is universal in terms of its application and translation from theory into practice? Should we focus just on the principles that come out of the theory and the research, or do we need to be focused on the specifics that have been the researchers have come up with? What about, it's one thing to have the evidence about what is best practice and what works, but how does that work alongside the quality standards in how we do it? It's all right to say what we do, but then what about the quality standards that support how we do things, and how that also impacts on the ethics of how we go about our work? And so what are the challenges when we come to the people who are working at ground level? And in the sense, as Shamil has referred to, my background has been very much based on the practice and trying to implement it at the real level, and knowing that there are challenges that always are going to occur, even if you wish to translate sound theory into practice. I always remember meeting an eminent researcher who came up with some significant findings about prevention and how it works. And he said to me, but I've got to be honest, we had the money, we could do it all in greenhouse conditions, and we could conduct our theories and our research, and we got some really interesting and important outcomes in terms of what works from what we did. But we've got to also remember that the reality is we don't have greenhouse conditions. We don't have all the money to do it. And if we can try and get people to see what the theory can work, we also have to address the challenges that are faced in that real world. So beyond that, to also say, how can what we do and what we achieve, how can we make that impact both practice and policy? And how do we move forward in identifying, once we've got theory, we apply it to practice, we then identify the challenges. How do we then react to those challenges? How do we then move forward in our action plan to refine and improve how we go about our work, be it in prevention, treatment, or recovery support? How do we begin to work together to implement? So I just finally want to say, those of you that know me well, I know that I'm always trying to bring in football somewhere, soccer if you're an American, and whilst drug demand reduction is a team effort, and as I've always tried to say, that we have supply control as the forward line, but the work of the midfield and the defence is fundamental, and that's where we have our work in prevention and treatment and recovery support. And it's a team effort, but at the same time, whilst we need to work as a team, we have to remember that there are always going to be differences between what we do in each of those areas of the field. We don't all do the same, all face the same challenges, or have the same way of what we go about and play our game. So we have to remember what are the differences between our work in those three areas, what constitutes each area in terms of its theory and best evidence base. What is the knowledge base for each of them? It's in treatment, it may be a little bit easier to know what is right and wrong and what you should and should not do. A little bit more different when you come to looking at prevention, and the more difficult rights and wrongs that always apply, but at the same time we know there is a way of going about our prevention work that we have to understand and look at how we can translate it. What is the amount of evidence? Have we enough evidence? How can we build that evidence base internationally, not only within, as we know, most has been in Western developed country settings? How can we build the evidence that we need? And on what basis do we apply it? I think we need to then look at what we've got in terms of new learning and how we apply that, certainly in prevention science and recovery support. They're relatively new areas of science that we're now learning increasingly about what works and what's effective and what are the principles that we need to apply. But we need to continue to build that evidence base. We need to think about how we help those who are involved in applying the practice, and realizing that there are, for many people, access to information and knowledge and support is very difficult. We need to think about the policymakers and who makes the policy and how we can help and support them. And we have to look at how we can get the team effort working together and supporting each other. I often feel that, particularly in prevention, for example, we spend a lot of time arguing amongst ourselves rather than putting our work together in how we can promote ourselves. But that's another story, another discussion. What I would like to say then to finish my piece off is just to say that this is the beginning of a discussion that I think is already there. It's already taking place. We have built a lot on building an evidence base. ISSUP has played a key role in helping to promote the professionalization of the workforce so that what we do is based on good science and evidence. But we now need to look at how we can help implement the practice and address the challenges. So yes, let's see this as the start of how we can move forward. I want to sincerely appreciate all those who are contributing to this 3 days. I hope you will contribute with your questions and answers, and that this dialogue can continue in the months and years ahead. Education isn't just filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. So I hope we can light or build and fuel that fire this week. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff, again for an amazing presentation, just setting the frame for the next 3 days and for the whole conference. You really have clearly outlined the key issues. In fact, you have deconstructed reality by outlining these are the key issues when we translate theory into practice. These are the considerations from science to policy, and I think no one could have done it so concisely and better. So thank you so much, and I hope that we would have a lively discussion after our next presenter. So we look forward to that. Thank you again, Jeff. So our next presenter is Professor Harry Sumner from the Liverpool Institute of Public Health at Liverpool John Moores University. I know you're a scientist and you have a particular interest in psychedelics, and you did your Ph.D. on MDMA, but you've gone beyond that into the policy realm, into developing interventions, and a broad contribution to drug demand reduction. So it's very exciting to hear what you have to say, and also you have played in the United Kingdom, you have played key roles in the Government's Advisory Council for Misuse of Drugs, which is a key body that decides on policy, and you're advisor to the Mind Foundation and to the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction. So we are very much looking forward to your talk. Professor Sumner.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I'll just proceed to share my screen. Great, so I hope everybody can see that. It's great to be here, and thank you very much to ISSUP for the very kind introduction. I'll just try and minimize this. Okay, so all set. So thank you very much for that introduction. So I'm going to be talking this afternoon about some key issues and hopefully responding to some of the challenges that Jeff Lee raised in his talk, particularly about understanding what do we actually mean by quality in drug demand reduction. What do we actually mean in terms of evidence-based practice? Is this a definition which has been contested? Has our understanding of evidence-based practice changed? I'll also consider for example, around professional cultures and how we need to reflect on professional cultures in order to move our field forward to be more receptive to evidence-based approaches. And hopefully, if we have time, I'll say a few words, share a few thoughts about what I think around ethical issues in this field as well. And just to note here that my main area of specialism is around prevention, but I think a lot of the things I'll be talking about in my talk today are also very relevant for treatment services in its spectrum of responses, recovery services, but also harm reduction as well. I think these are all key responses to issues and problems around substance use. I suppose our first challenge, and this might seem an obvious one, and it might seem like an obvious answer to this, but why do we actually need an evidence-based approach in drug demand reduction? Well, because we do, is the simple answer. But we know, for example, for some of the global burden of disease studies, that alcohol and other drug use are hugely important contributors to global disease burden. And alcohol in particular is a significant risk factor when we're thinking about non-communicable diseases across different age groups. So this is not just an issue around young people, of course, and young adults. These are considerations across different age groups. And I think also one of the reasons why we need a dedication and an emphasis on evidence-based approaches is because of the complexity of this issue that we're talking about. So substance use disorders don't just live within the medical field or the social field or the public health field or the legal field. This is an issue which cuts across different fields and different specialisms. So we need to ensure a level playing field with regards to quality approaches. And I think, as Brian also alluded to in his opening remarks, that even though we've seen some fantastic and important developments with respect to the evidence-based and understanding what works, I think there's probably still many outdated and stigmatizing views around substances and the people who use substances. And this, of course, can have an impact on the sorts of priorities that decision makers and professionals as well have, and certainly with regards to the choice of priorities and what to focus on, particularly in drug strategies. I think it's important to recognise as well that, yes, there has been some important developments in many areas of drug demand reduction, but to be fair, we probably know a lot more about what doesn't work. And we have a lot of areas where there's very limited evidence base as well. Something else which I'm not going to touch on today, but I think is also important, that, and I think Jeff alluded to this, that yes, we have some really interesting findings, scientific findings, but where we have gaps is how to implement this work with high quality. So I will be saying something about quality standards and the importance of quality standards and guidance. My last point is, this is fundamental, certainly to my thinking and my work on this topic, that it's morally and ethically the right thing to do, to base our policy and practice on the best available evidence, taking into account other factors as well, which I'll mention. But for me personally, we have a moral duty to implement evidence-based approaches. I want to start off with a definition. So what is evidence-based policy and practice? Multiple definitions. Some are quite straightforward and simplistic. So an approach which is informed by research rather than rumour, prejudice or unexamined assumptions. And unfortunately, in the drug demand reduction field, I think there still are a lot of unexamined assumptions. Then there's perhaps more sophisticated definitions. Some which take a more narrow definition, narrow approach, where the focus is only on the highest quality research evidence. And I'll say a bit more about that later on. But also broader approaches, which I think is perhaps more interesting and more useful, where we take a more flexible flexible view on what we define and qualify as evidence, taking in different perspectives of evidence, and really using the research findings, research designs, and research models that are best able to answer tough questions, rather than focusing on particularly perceived gold standards. So I don't think there's a single useful definition, but for me, the principle that guides my work is on the screen here, that an approach that emphasizes the importance of consistent and cost-effective decision-making that moves away from action based on anecdotal evidence or intuitive assumptions about effective practice and policy. And I spent a large proportion of my career in the prevention field trying to challenge some of these assumptions about what works, particularly in the prevention field. And that can be a hard task sometimes. Now, moving on to the issue of quality, and what does high quality practice look like in this particular field? And I think it's important to recognize that different stakeholders might have different conceptualizations of quality. So I'm an academic. I've spent my working life researching prevention and harm reduction and treatment and risk behaviors. My perspective of quality might be very different from the perspective of a policymaker or a practitioner, but both perspectives have validity. So, for example, my academic perspective is that, yes, we need to be sensitive to policy, we need to be sensitive to strategy, but actually it's important to have an independent perspective on evidence. Whereas from a policy and particularly practitioner perspective, is the work is responsive to public and political priorities. So an important difference there. As a researcher, of course, I'm always striving to make use of the best available evidence. As I'll talk about in a moment, in policy and practice, evidence can mean something quite different. And that doesn't mean that it's not useful, not a useful body of evidence, but different definitions of what evidence actually is. I think sometimes in academia and in the research field, I think we sometimes have a bit of an unrealistic expectation or unrealistic view of what it's actually like working in policy and practice. So we talk about ensuring having long-term sustained activities and interventions, whereas perhaps policy and practice, it's often a case where we're moving from one funding timeline to another, and it's sometimes difficult to take this long-term view in drug demand reduction. So different perspectives on high quality, but I think both have a validity. And I mentioned in my definition of evidence-based approaches before that we sometimes have this narrow focus on the highest quality research designs. So this is an evidence pyramid that I often use with my students when we're talking about research methods and research skills. This is fine. So I think a scientific consensus is that randomized controlled trials and systematic reviews and meta-analysis would be considered the gold standard of evidence, but that can only take us so far, because these sorts of studies don't really tell us about important factors such as reach, effectiveness in routine practice, the greenhouse or the glass house that Jeff alluded to. They don't tell us about sustainability or how interventions are modified in everyday practice as a result of being delivered into different social and cultural contexts. A lot of research can't tell us anything about this. So some of this purified research evidence is of little use, to be honest, in many communities. So I think we need a broad spectrum of research designs, not just those at the top of the pyramid, to help us to understand, yes, is the particular approach effective, but also how it's been implemented and how well these approaches have been delivered. And just pausing for a moment, thinking about the environment in which our activities are delivered, particularly in the field of drug policy. Now, all policy arenas are controversial, but drug policy in particular is controversial. And I'm not talking here about discussions of, for example, of legalization of drug law reform, although that, of course, is complicated. But even within what I might consider mainstream drug demand reduction approaches, it's still a complex area beset by ideological divisions. So there's international and local perspectives. There's often domestic tensions. We live, of course, in a global policy world, and often our responses to drugs and the problems associated with drugs are not simply a health or social response, but also take into account, for example, diplomacy, international cooperation. international law enforcement activities, and sometimes military activities as well. So we're working within a highly controversial area, and within these areas of controversy, a purified view of evidence-based practice is simply not adequate. We need to understand the context in which we're delivering these activities. And as I said, this is not unique to the drugs field. If you're working in environmental policy, food policy, transport policy, this would be the same controversies here. But for me, it's important as researchers and practitioners, etc., to recognize that the work that we do, even the so-called objective scientific research that we do, is also value-laden, from decisions to ask specific questions, how we frame particular problems, what interventions and actions we choose to prioritize within research, and how we actually evaluate success of those approaches. And I think sometimes as researchers and scientists, and even practitioners as well, we perhaps don't scrutinize the values, the personal and shared values that we have around important questions like this. And I mentioned before that there's different ways of thinking about evidence, and some really interesting work emerging from the UK, and I'm a big fan of these researchers' work, Catherine Oliver and Frank Potts, for example. And these are some really interesting work about, yes, moving away from those narrow, purified understandings of evidence, in inverted commas, to actually engage with decision makers, policy makers, politicians, civil servants. What do they actually value as evidence when they're making decisions, when they're developing strategy, when they're prioritizing different actions? Yes, academic evidence is important in this, but they bring in a whole other set of considerations as well. Public opinion, of course, is hugely important. Bringing in narratives of historical developments in the field, how an issue has progressed historically, how a country or structures have responded to that issue, is also important evidence. And of course, in the pressurized and politicized arena of policy making, we know, of course, that knowledge and evidence gained through interpersonal interactions or drawing upon expert committees and influential individuals, evidence by eminence, as it's sometimes called, is also important. Now, we might feel uncomfortable about this. We might try and encourage a more narrow and purified view of evidence-based approaches, but that's not the reality of policymaking. And if we want to think about shifting the way that decision makers think about evidence, think about research, in order to develop their strategies in accordance with evidence, we also have to appreciate all of these factors which influence the way that they think. And I think we also need to be realistic about the policy making process. Now, I've seen many training manuals in drug demand reduction about how to engage in the policy making process, always presenting an idealized policy making cycle, which seems very rational, from problem definition to identification of options to evaluation and implementation, and there's a very formal feedback process there. And that's fine for textbooks, but as I'm sure those of you working in policy will appreciate, the reality is a lot messy than this. All of these stages and factors are interacting. There's also external factors, including commercial factors, as we think about newly emerging industries, such as cannabis industry, for example. There's also the valued input of civil society, the business community, the public at large, people who are directly affected by policy and practice, i.e. people who use substances. So taking into account their values, their expectations, and their interpretations of evidence complicates these discussions as well. Now, I hope I haven't presented too much of a pessimistic picture so far. So can research evidence actually change policy and practice? Well, yes, of course it can. And I'm sure we can draw upon many examples here. But we need to respect and reflect upon that politics and public opinion almost always trumps evidence, not exclusively, but almost always. And we need to recognise as well, particularly those of us who engage in research on a day-to-day basis, that much of the research that we produce actually has no policy relevance, or because of the way that research is funded and how it's commissioned, it often supports the policy and practice status quo. There's very little research that's actually groundbreaking or revolutionary. So we need to recognise the limitations of the impact that research can have on policy and practice. And also appreciating the chaotic and inverted commas lives of policymakers and the competing pressures on their working lives and their professional lives. They're working with within highly charged environments, within election cycles, for example, pressures from ministers, from voters, for example, multiple competing priorities. So is it any surprise that perhaps narrow forms of research evidence are often not prioritized? And we also need to think about playing the long game. So I've been involved on the peripheries, but also directly involved in UK policy making. And when I first entered that particular realm as a slightly younger, fresh-faced and idealistic researcher, I was quite astounded by the amount of time it took to implement what I thought would be meaningful policy change. But then I quickly began to understand the reality of policy making and the lives of decision makers, and understood that yes, as researchers and practitioners, we might want rapid change. We need to play the long game here. For example, work looking at knowledge exchange and implementation more generally has estimated that on average, regardless of the topic you're looking at, it takes about 17 years for research to really meaningfully translate into routine practice. And even then, only a small proportion of the wider body of research actually makes that transition. So we need to think about the long game here, that yes, sometimes policy is rapid and sometimes there are rapid changes, and this can often take us by surprise. But we need to have long-term plans when we're thinking about developing the field and orientating the field towards more evidence-based approaches. I'm not going to linger too long on this, but my slides will be available. And if you do want to contact me, I can send you some, what I think some really interesting research about how to advocate evidence-based practice and policy change. And Paul Kelly and Catherine Oliver have summarised this in some highly influential reviews. So it's not just a case of presenting evidence. We can't just present solutions. We can't just present our favoured drug demand reduction approaches. We have to work to shift awareness of the public and decision makers to this particular topic that we're interested in. How do we make those decision makers care and prioritise about the same things that we do within the drug demand reduction field? So yes, scientific evidence is important, but I think I know from experience that scientists and researchers are often really bad at putting a human face on really important stories, which we need to frame this research evidence within. So scientists and researchers need to be part of multidisciplinary teams, work with people who have the skills to tell a good story, work with affected communities and advocacy groups and civil society groups. So if like me, you're a researcher or a scientist, but perhaps have a more modest input into these processes and work with other people with much better experience of enacting policy change. Okay, moving on to consider about, well, how do we bring about a transfer of knowledge into practice and policy? Now, this is an idealised knowledge transfer process, and this has been developed by the European Monitoring Centre on Drugs and Drugs Addiction, and I think this is a really good idealised overview. So problem identification, develop research evidence. This might lead to practice recommendations, quality standards and guidelines, which I'll talk about a bit later on. And this leads to the development and implementation of policy interventions. And we know that the scale of activity can move from perhaps a global evidence-based to more localized policy interventions. That's somewhat idealized, just like the policy cycle. I think reality is a bit messier than that. Because what we're in fact doing is delivering knowledge into a really complicated system of activity. And within this system of activity, there's dynamic interactions by different actors and organizations, different priorities and values. The system in which we're delivering knowledge and research evidence is affected by wider social, political and professional climates, and the tensions and dynamic interactions between all of those. And once you introduce evidence within this system, it changes the nature of the system itself. So if, for example, if you introduce a particular intervention modality that we might know to be effective and works in particular ways, then the system might change to start to prioritize that particular approach to the detriment of other approaches. So knowledge generation as part of that feedback process is narrowed. So thinking about those sorts of systems that I mentioned, this is an idealized prevention system. I'm most familiar with the prevention field, but I suspect that treatment and recovery systems would look similar if you try to map them in a particular diagrammatic format. So, for example, research and researchers and interactions with academia is here at the top, and the structures of governance which interact with knowledge generation. This leads to the development of interventions which are require a workforce to deliver this, implementation at different scale, and then of course the challenges of reaching target populations. And this is probably an idealized system that we can all recognize. But how do you actually deliver that? And where does evidence come into this? And I would suggest that narrow forms of research evidence probably have very little to tell us about these sorts of systems and how we actually develop work around workforce competencies, for example, professional development, or how we reach target populations. And we need a whole other system of activity. So here are a few examples of projects funded by the European Union, for example, representing millions of euros of research funding, really dedicated and applied research to help us to understand different components within this, what seems at first like an idealized and simplistic system. So, for example, understanding how and why different interventions and actions are implemented, understanding how we monitor that implementation. How do we train the workforce? What sort of competencies do we think the workforce should have? How do we develop overarching policy and practice quality standards? And some of the work that I've been involved with at the European level has tried to address this and has probably led to more questions than answers. So yes, we do need an understanding about the system in which we deliver knowledge, in which we deliver evidence, but then also need to be very aware of the fact that we also need to develop components within that system as well. And often, just from a personal perspective, the type of research which is very difficult to undertake, and not many researchers, at least not many academic researchers in the drug demand reduction field, do this really important work. And I think in particular, most of the great work in this area has been done by practitioners, decision makers in collaboration with more academic researchers. So I think how we develop systems is truly a collaborative and partnership-based approach. There are tools to help us with some of these elements. So I've mentioned quality standards and guidelines before, and workforce development and competencies. So in the United Kingdom, where I'm based, On Monday, the government announced a new 10-year drug strategy. So as well as all of its priority actions around demand reduction, supply reduction, etc., there's a really important focus on workforce development and workforce competencies. And sometimes that's an element which is missed out of national strategies, but it's absolutely essential. And if we're talking about the uptake of evidence into practice, then we shouldn't ignore that. So this is one reason why I'm delighted to be able to talk to the ISSUP conference today, because I really feel this has been an underdeveloped and understudied area. There are tools out there. So of course we have the universal prevention and treatment curricula, which have been developed, and it's great to read about the development of those particular curriculum and the training program associated with that. International organisations have also developed standards around intervention activities, evidence-based standards. I'm very familiar with the prevention quality standards which have been developed by the UNODC. If you work in prevention and you're not familiar with this particular document, I highly recommend it. Some fantastic advice and guidance around the sorts of approaches we need to take. And also on a domestic level, on a national level, there might also be complementary activities. So in the United Kingdom, we have the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, which has developed clinical and social care guidelines about responding to more problematic forms of drug use and prevention as well. And there's issued quality standards as well, which define the expectations in quality and delivery. So it's really interesting international initiatives. We also need to think about the more general workforce, I think, as well. Some interesting work has been done looking at the treatment and prevention workforce in Europe. And I'm sure this is probably repeated internationally as well, and repeated globally, that particularly outside clinical treatment activities, we tend to find that specialisms in other areas of drug demand reduction are actually secondary to other specialist roles. So by this I mean, for example, that a treatment or recovery or a prevention worker is usually subsumed under training for to be a social worker or psychologist. There's very little specialist training in those dedicated fields that we need. And we need to recognise this, that yes, we need to develop particular training pathways for that specialised workforce. But recognise, because drug demand reduction is such a complex and multi-componented field, that many different types of professionals also have a part to play. So this is just an example from Health Scotland in the UK, where they're looking at health and social care, recognising that other professions had a really important part to play. So they were seeking to develop foundational competencies. Foundational skills, which could also be applied and transferred to more specialised work. And I think this approach is particularly useful in the prevention field, because I think globally we have very few dedicated prevention professionals. And as I mentioned before, the work in the prevention field is primarily done by social workers and psychologists, secondary to their usual working practices. So what about quality standards, which I've referred to a few times? So quality standards are principles and rules set by recognised national or international bodies about what to do and what to aim for. And the important thing about quality standards is they propose clear and aspirational yet measurable statements. And these often relate to how we structure and deliver services, rather than the interventions themselves, which are often covered by guidelines, and often focus on processes, how we deliver and organise drug demand reduction activities. So for many years, I was involved in the development of quality standards in drug prevention at an EU level, and this is very much what we were focused on. We hardly ever thought about the interventions at the end of the process. That's usually developed in the realm of guidelines and protocols. A particular challenge in the development of quality standards is the selection of appropriate indicators. and also how we evidence achievement of those particular indicators. I know that's certainly something that we struggled with in the European projects. I think we found an answer in the end though. And there's positives and negatives around the use of quality standards. For me, I think the main positive, if we're thinking about improving the overall standard of evidence-based practice and policy activities, they support organisations in different sectors and fields to work towards the same outcomes. Now, of course, that's very important for topics such as substance use, where we need to be working together across mental health, physical mental health care, housing, employment, etc. So they allow us to work towards the same outcomes. And hopefully, maybe this is slightly optimistic, help us to reduce unnecessary variability of delivery, so we can be assured of the same quality of delivery across those different sectors. They can be a useful evaluative tool as well. So we did some work where we used, we worked with different organisations and helped them to use quality standards as a form of monitoring and evaluation in order to progress through cycles of quality improvement, developing their services and how they approach drug demand reduction. And we also have examples as well where quality standards have been used to support decision makers in funding. And I recall a program in Croatia, for example, where projects had to demonstrate a commitment to develop their practice in prevention around quality standards we had developed, but also to undergo training and develop their professional competencies around quality standards as well. So multiple uses. There's also negatives as well. So we need to recognise this, that it's really important to consider and reflect on the trustworthiness, credibility of organisations that have developed these standards. Do they have buy-in and support from those working in the field? Really important, because if you don't have that trust and credibility, why should people working in drug demand reduction take your quality standards seriously? There's also a danger, I think, and we've certainly encountered this in our own work, that what might happen is that once practitioners and other people working within drug demand reduction become more familiar with the language of quality standards, there's often a move to standardise the language. So professionals talk about what they do using the key phrases which are included in quality standards documents without actually improving the standard of their practice, if that makes sense. So they talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk, to coin a cliche. So we really need to be careful to make sure that it's not just the language that has changed. Has there been meaningful changes in the policy of practice? Another consideration is that we want quality standards to be aspirational. So this basically means we need to develop basic minimum quality standards that we want all organisations and actors to work towards. But we should have a high level of standards as well that organisations should aspire to. But can we ensure that our foundational basic minimum quality standards will actually produce the changes and the impacts that we want them to? And there's probably been very little research into the actual real world impact of quality standards. Does incorporation of standards make a difference with regards to drug-related outcomes? If you're aware of research in this area, please do send it to me, because I often struggle finding relevant work here. Moving on to guidelines. And those of you working in clinical practice will be very familiar with guidelines which govern almost every aspect of clinical work. And like quality standards, they're often produced by multidisciplinary, sometimes international groups of experts. So there's guidelines in drug treatment developed by the World Health Organization, for example. But this is often based on practice rather than the processes which quality standards cover. And it's often based, it takes this purer evidence-based, this more narrow evidence-based approach. Sometimes it's very difficult to develop guidelines, especially in areas of work where there's little high-quality evidence. And this is where all those other forms of evidence, in its broadest sense, are really important So I've sat on several national guidelines development committees where there's been almost no available evidence, and this is where you draw upon those additional forms of evidence and expertise as well. Again, pros and cons, I'll briefly mention a couple of these. They're often based on good quality evidence of what works. They can often be used as good political tools. So if formal and well-respected bodies and organisations have developed guidelines, they can then approach decision makers, politicians, to say, look, this is the best possible evidence in a particular area. It's been endorsed by this august organisation who represent the professional workforce. What are you going to do about this? And the best guidelines are not too proscriptive. They also leave space for professional judgment, because sometimes a criticism of guidelines is that they're inflexible and they restrict innovation or professional practice. And, you know, as I suggested before, I think in some fields, particularly in the treatment field, there's probably an abundance of guidelines. And some of these guidelines actually might conflict with regards to what they're suggesting. Some guidelines are outdated, need to be continually updated. But overall, quality standards and guidelines have a useful part to play in drug demand reduction. I'm just mindful of time, but I did want to say a few words about ethics and ethical practice and policy. This is something which doesn't really get discussed in many fora, but I think it's really important. In my view, my definition of ethical practice and policy is that it's work which is evidence-informed, evidence-based, but work that is characterised by ethical and lawful conduct of the provider, and really importantly, is orientated towards participants' rights, autonomy, and needs. So I spoke right at the beginning about some of the outdated views and some stigmatizing views on substance use, also interventions as well. So an ethical approach to drug demand reduction demands that we actually challenge some of these outdated views. Some further considerations. I think it's important that not just on a professional body level, but also at a service level, a delivery level, there's a development and monitoring of a code of ethics. We need to ensure that activities provide real benefits for participants. I know this can sometimes be difficult, particularly in responses in the criminal justice field. We need to be able to balance coercion versus autonomy. If we look at other areas of health and social care, the primacy of autonomy, patient and client autonomy is there. Sometimes the drug demand reduction field, we don't take that seriously. So I think we need to look at that. There's also emerging ethical considerations, commercial conflicts of interest. Brian at the beginning mentioned the opioid overdose crisis in the USA, the emergence of, for example, the cannabis industry. Other ethical considerations about rigid and unevidenced barriers to evidence-based treatment and support, including, for example, medications, assisted treatment, and harm reduction approaches like needle exchanges, but also ethical considerations looking at broader health and social policy. And are we as a field challenging some of these broader policies that we know are going to affect people that we work with? For example, economic policy, housing policy, criminal justice policy, which might not be directly labelled drug policy, but have real impact on some of the most marginalised and excluded members of our community. I'm mindful of time, so I think I'm going to end there. I did want to say a few words about professional culture, but perhaps we can maybe have a discussion about that in the Q&A, maybe to share some thoughts about some of the changes that I think might be needed in order to reorientate professional cultures towards this more evidence-based approach. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you found my talk useful.
Thank you, Professor Sumnall. I was listening to this with, I would say, excitement. I hope that you spoke to the 550 almost participants in this webinar as you spoke to me. because I've, to apply the struggle of, I would say, the curse of the randomized controlled trial and meta-analysis that comes from pharmacology to other spheres. In clinical practice, I've battled with it for over 25 years, and we need advocates to redefine what we mean by evidence. And I thought your talk covered so much, and particularly in a field of prevention, to bring these issues, that it is a far more complex picture, and how we persuade policymakers and others to listen to us, and not to go to this so-called gold standard, which is we're stuck with. I mean, Professor Keith Humphreys talks about that, if you look at the exclusion criteria for some of these randomized control trials, you need to get people from Mars. So it doesn't fit the reality even in clinical practice. So the debates about practice-based evidence as opposed to evidence-based practice, and of course empirically guided clinical interventions, these debates have been going on for my knowledge for the last 25 years in clinical practice. But to bring it into prevention, I think is very important. And you also touched upon quality standards, and again, you spoke to me in terms of, I've kind of dedicated myself for much of my professional life to workforce development and competency. So this is where we can make evidence. So thank you very much for such a comprehensive and broad talk. And I have got questions coming at me at great speed. So you'll have to bear with me when I kind of select the questions. Okay, one question is, could you talk a bit more about the intuitive assumptions? Now, this is probably the counter argument to this. Intuitive assumptions that are often so well intentioned, but can be damaging. And how can we address that, as opposed to evidence and intuitiveness? I know best to, this is the RCT evidence, and that's a really good question.
Yeah, it is a very good question. And before I answer it, I think I need to frame it that the answer to that question is also very culturally based as well. So intuition about what is the best response, with the good intentions, will depend on culture and geography. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. So from my cultural perspective, best intentions are around assumptions that we all have about the causes and consequences of substance use, for example, and therefore what are the best ways to respond to that. Now, I've done most of my work in the prevention field. I'm sure there's many relevant examples in treatment. So a very popular approach historically is about the use of fear arousal and scare tactics in trying to scare young people out of using drugs. So intuitively, that would assume that all we need to do is raise fears about substance use, the consequences of substance use, including overdose, addiction, and that would be enough. So intuitively, you think, well, good intentions would be to develop a campaign around that. But for example, the evidence shows us that when presented with fear arousal approaches, young people go to psychological defense modes, and they work to actually control and respond to the fear that's aroused, rather than actually taking on board the key messages. So that's one example. So these lay in everyday conceptualizations that we have about substance use can actually be harmful. I'm less experienced with regards to the treatment approach, but for example, and I don't want to generalize, but globally, we often hear of punishment or boot camp approaches to treatment, particularly those linked with stricter criminal justice approaches. And intuitively, it seems to punish substance use for being an immoral behavior, for example. Well, we know that doesn't work. The evidence tells us that substance use disorders are complex, multifaceted conditions. Whether we want to use the language of disease or brain disorders or choice or social behaviors, it doesn't really matter. These are complicated and complex issues. So that's what I meant by intuitive approaches, that a lot of the historical development in the understanding of substance use and what are the best ways to respond to that have often been framed in traditions, in morality, into misconceptions, etc. And that can sometimes be harmful.
Thank you. Jeff, would you like to comment on this?
Only to reinforce the issue around culture and how different cultures will respond to the same issue, and different cultures will respond differently. I can think of examples where often, for example, a very religious-based approach where a strong community believes that something is having an impact, that may be counter to what the evidence base is saying from a different culture. And I think that does create a challenge of how we respond to that when you've got a very different perception of what does make a change and what does impact on people, that comes from the point of view of where a culture or a particular position has been embedded over many years, and how do you change that perspective is a real challenge. Or should you change that perspective? Who changes it, on what basis?
Thank you. But it's kind of related to another question about how do we develop capacity for evidence uptake in low to middle income countries where access to evidence may be lacking, and how do we bring people into the team or into our work? I think particularly challenging.
I think there are organisations who are dedicated to this, including ISSUP, so perhaps Jeff is best placed to talk about this. I do know, for example, that the treatment and prevention team at the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime are very much focused on developing professional capacity and professional structures. But I'm sure Jeff will have a lot to say about international development.
Only to say, Harry, I think it is about what I think we're all saying, is the need to how we can build the networks of working together. That there's often been a fear of universities and academia and research from the people working on the ground, and the more we can build that network and interaction and dialogue and understanding between different organizations, different communities, different NGOs, different universities, to get a greater sharing and understanding and learning. And I think you said that earlier as well, is the only way forward. And I think that's beginning to happen, but it's a slow process. It has been an us and them in many aspects in the past, and I think it's beginning to develop and grow. So this has to be a multidisciplinary sharing network of learning together as to how we address these issues.
I think, Jeff, you kind of answered the next question as well, but maybe there are different answers to this. It's essentially about how do we get buy-in of the target population, role of input from the target population in terms of drug demand reduction and their involvement in kind of buying in this message and applying this work. Sorry.
Jeff, are you going to answer that, or should I have a quick go?
I think you'll be good at this one, Harry.
Yeah, so, and again, just reflecting on my prevention work, but this is relevant to treatment and recovery, we can't do anything without the buy-in of target groups. We need to respect and co-produce activities in partnership with target groups, even where it's difficult to negotiate the expectations and desired outcomes of those target groups. If target groups don't perhaps share some of the expected outcomes of intervention and actions, we need to respect that. That would be the key principles, another area of public health and clinical support. So we also need to apply those principles as well. And perhaps also taking a more realistic view of the consequences of substance use. And I'm not trying to be deliberately controversial here, but recognizing perhaps that the evidence is telling us that for many people, substance use, although it is a prescribed activity, legally controlled activity, is probably not problematic in terms of substance use disorders or addiction. And therefore, the sorts of support that those groups will need would be very different, depending upon group needs. So I think we need to embrace complexity and diversity with it across populations, and come to the realization that often target populations know best. They certainly know better than I do. I wouldn't presume to speak for target populations about what we should do.
But ensuring their buy-in, Jeff, I mean, I think that's the key, isn't it? How do we do that?
And just to add, I think, again, if we look at this is a long-term process, it's got to be about education and inclusion and addressing the reasons why we can't target and include the target populations, because there are lots of political issues and considerations there. There's public opinion, there's the media, there's stigma, and how we address those areas before we can bring people on board to say that we should include the people who are actually the people we want to help. And back to, I think Harry opened up about the issue of alcohol, an issue if we're going to address alcohol as a major problem in terms of substance use. We don't seem to be disinclined to talk to people who use and drink. Therefore, why don't we in terms of other substances? But I think there's a lot of complexity in terms of public opinion.
Yeah. It is difficult, isn't it? I mean, I think the other question, this related question brings in, I think, the COVID issue in some ways, seeing that politics, public opinion, and other external factors trump evidence, thus affecting policy. How can we strike the balance so that policy can be implemented that is beneficial to those who really need it? And I think immediately when I saw this question, I thought of the policies related to COVID and how we are dealing with the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. We can only try our best, but my view has always been that we don't live in a technocracy, regardless of what our country of residence is, and that is the nature of political engagement, community engagement, and public life. That yes, we hope and we pray that decision makers take into account scientific evidence and make wise choices on the basis of that. But the way that society has developed, the reason why we elect particular politicians or particular political parties is not based on technocratic decisions about evidence. It's about values, the way we wish society to develop. In particular, around COVID, we have lots of discussions about freedoms and individual choice. I might not like it, but I think we have to respect that that is what a healthy, functioning society is like. And we can just try and hope to influence that process in positive ways.
And it highlights the complexity of the process, isn't it? It really, and the parallels between substance or drug and substance world, and this is quite strong. This question is, Jeff, do you want to comment on that before I go on to the next question?
That's fine, please move on.
Yeah, I am a prevention staff at a prevention center, and here many schools prefer short informational approaches rather than evidence-based full programs or school climate improvement. How do we reinforce the need for evidence-based work with audiences who do not see the importance? I mean, this is the question, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, it is. And that's the perennial question in the prevention field. And again, it's a good example of intuitive approaches. So short information, young people will be educated and therefore will take the autonomous decision not to use substances. I think it's important to clarify with decision makers at whatever level those decisions are taken, whether that's at a regional level or a school level or a family level, what sort of outcomes do those decision makers actually want? Do they want approaches which delay the onset and escalation of substance use? Are they there to promote resilience? What are the outcomes, for example, what are the outcomes that those different decision makers value? And once you're able to have that conversation and establish those outcomes and get buy-in for those outcomes, once you've done that, then you can actually talk about, well, what's the most appropriate ways to achieve that. So at a school level, for example, where a lot of prevention work is delivered, the priority there in the busy and highly pressured school environment might be on educational outcomes. And therefore, the quickened, easy information session is probably desirable. But we also know that good drug prevention also leads to school retention, school engagement, and better educational outcomes. It's about how we frame our approaches, to look beyond perhaps the drug-related outcomes, particularly with young people, looking at healthy development more generally, and selling prevention and other drug demand reduction activities with regards to the outcomes that stakeholders are really interested in.
I'd only reinforce and say that I've always been worried that we've often talked about the issues in drugs in terms of information, not education. A lot of what we've done under the term of prevention has been information based, not educationally based. And again, it boils down to the fact of how do we engage with the appropriate stakeholders in educating them first. They're the gatekeepers to the young people. So how can we engage with those gatekeepers, be it parents, media, teachers? How can we professionalize the workforce so that they got the trust and respect of people who know how to go about implementing an appropriate provision in terms of prevention, or indeed of when it comes to the same for treatment. We wouldn't let anybody run our treatment program. We shouldn't let anybody run a prevention program in the school without the proper training. And the proper training should mean how do we approach and engage with other stakeholders that need to be on side and on board with us.
Yeah, I think thank you, Jeff. And Harry, also, I think you touched upon that in the pressurized school environment, there is a tick box approach, isn't it? We've done this, we've done prevention, and to overcome that, and because teachers are under pressure, schools are under pressure to perform and give results, so that is hugely challenging, and you feel for the person who is in the middle of this, trying to, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And just on that, it's I'm really excited by so-called whole school approaches to prevention. Now, for those of you who've been working in school health, you'd be very familiar with this. And this is moving away from particular sessions or prevention programs, but actually looking at the environments in which young people socialise and live their lives. So core prevention principles, however you want to define that, are infused not only just in the classroom, but at school level policies, interactions with parents and community organisations. It's what's worked with other areas of health, for example. So I'd really like to see, and again, maybe I'm just idealistic here, I would certainly like to see more schools in particular take that whole school approach to this issue.
Yeah.
It's a shorter question, but again, a good one. And yeah, this is a challenge. How much evidence is enough evidence?
If you ask a researcher, they'll say there's never enough evidence. And I'm not trying to be flippant, but if we look at researchers, particularly university researchers and academic researchers, they're always going to have new ways of thinking about an issue. There's always going to be new questions to ask, and there's always going to be questions to ask because there's often research funding attached to that. How much evidence is enough evidence? It's a tricky one. My view has always been that, I'll slightly reframe this, that we shouldn't let an undeveloped evidence base in a particular area prevent us entirely from doing work in that area. Because if, from my perspective, I was trying to present that we also need to take into account other considerations as well, professional practice, professional experience, for example. So we can introduce new ways of working when perhaps there isn't a solid evidence base, but we have confidence through our experience that it will do more good than harm. And we build in research and evaluation into the implementation of that. So it's kind of based on a precautionary principle that if we need to balance up what would be the impact of not doing anything. Now, of course, we also need to take into account the problems and challenges of taking unhelpful intuitive approaches, but we shouldn't perhaps let the absence of evidence in a particular area stifle us. Otherwise, we probably do very little work in some areas.
Thank you. I think it might be from the same person who elaborates on this, that it is indicated in the slides that the more evidence research delivers, the harder for the consensus to be reached. And can you articulate this point regarding the consensus? Is it that the consensus of policy making or research evidence, and how so? And yeah, it's again the same. How much is enough, and how do we reach?
It is, and again, just speaking as a researcher, I think it's important for research and research evidence to help clarify an issue, to help describe an issue, problem, and to help suggest particular ways of responding to that. But in terms of the ambiguity of response, so what should policymakers choose out of an option, a suite of responses? That is not a question for researchers. Some researchers might disagree with me, but that is based upon the values and pressures and working life of decision makers. I think it's the responsibility of researchers to help decision makers reach that decision, but the path to follow, the strategy to develop, the policy to pursue, that is for elected officials and civil servants to decide upon.
Jeff, you have a lot of experience in the non-governmental fields. What do you think?
I just think that the issue of evidence is that we obviously need to build and refine and develop the evidence base, because there'll always be conflicting evidence as well, and we need to address that there are going to be different views and different opinions over similar things. So we have to look at that, and then we have to look at not just the evidence, but the implementation of that evidence into practice. And what does that throw up in a sense, what this week's about? What does that throw up in terms of the challenges that means we need to look for more evidence or new evidence? Evidence can also mean that people don't use innovation and don't try out new ideas and because they rely on what has been told works. So we've got to get that balance right. And how we can
that balance, and again, to add to that, I think there's another question that said it takes 14. We had this figure from somewhere, isn't it? That it takes 14 years to for research to be translated, research into practice barriers. Do you see? How do you see you could? Any tips for speeding this up? This is again the question, but to add to that is there is lab to for bench to bed type of, for bench to prevention area, but then there is that kind of how much consensus we need to reach consensus, and then so the consensus process might slow things up. And as Jeff said, innovation gets lost in this because you can't do that because there is no evidence. So it is interesting, this whole area of how we can speed up translation, at the same time translate with gravitas or with confidence what we have.
And Shamil, I'd just add what I think Harry mentioned, is that I think people are often more convinced by the practice than they are by the research, and it's therefore how we can combine that research and practice working together into communicating it to the relevant decision makers, policy makers, funding providers is the key element. Again, it's about how we can collaborate with both sides of that coin of the research and practitioner, and provide the evidence on what has happened and what has happened in terms of our objective with respect to substance use. That's what will ultimately convince people.
And I think you beautifully summed up the purpose of this conference, as well as I think that you'd be encouraged by the quality of the questions, so that people are engaging with tackling these big issues, and these are the issues in reality. And it's very encouraging and exciting that people are grabbing and dealing and tackling with, and I hope that this is helpful to them in the front line to move forward. I don't seem to have been getting any more questions. So I don't know whether there are any other issues the speakers will go to bring up, or Olivia, how are we doing for time? No?
Yes, I think if there are no more questions, then it might be time to wrap up.
We've kind of had quite a good question. Anyway, it's my turn to thank you both again for I find both very exciting and kind of inspiring presentations, and from the feedback and the question, it shows that it is hitting the target and the audience. So thank you very much for the efforts and for participation, and I hope the rest of the conference, we've set a standard, quality standard, I think, for the rest of the conference. Thank you again, and thank you, Olivia, for the amazing technical backup, and all of the ISSUP team, and Brian and Joanna. So thank you very much. INL, Brian, and Joanna from ISSUP, before I get corrected. Thank you again. Thank you.
See you tomorrow. Please join us.
Bye.